What's up, everybody? Welcome back to another episode of Business is Hard and podcast. Obviously, we just shifted from Fail Fast to Success and kind of relaunched it with Business is Hard. And so I wanted to go over another big brand name that is out there, how it got there, the ups and the downs. And hopefully you can, one, take away from that, look, that it's not easy. Everything's hard. Whenever you get there, you're going to go through rough times. But most importantly, if you don't quit, you keep working towards your goals, you will come out stronger and you're going to come out better off from those times. But you have to remember that that's just part of the process. That's the norm. I know this from my own experience of building a business as well. And so I just want to point that out, obviously, to create a different perspective and mindset, maybe whenever you're going through things, but also to take away some points of maybe things that you should be looking out for, or points of how to make some changes or adapt in order to keep growing and to see that growth and get out of feeling stuck or that revenue roller coaster, so to speak. So I want to talk about Adidas. And the reason why I picked Adidas today is saw a note or a headline this morning that it looks like they're about to report their first annual loss in a couple of decades, I think since the year 2000. So I saw that, and a lot of people were just speculating that it's because of their breakup with Kanye West and the Easy brand, but I don't know too much more about that. So don't want to get in, once again, on these brands, on these businesses. I'm not going to get way into the history and all of that. I really want to talk about the rough patches and then what they did that created those rough patches, but also to what they did to get out of those as well. So what I wanted to start off with, and just a real quick story, not getting into too much, but I think if I remember correctly, that their Adidas was actually started by two brothers. Something happened between them. One left and started another brand to compete against Adidas and his brother, and that brand is Puma, I believe. So just kind of a cool story. But Adidas really, I think it was a World Cup, whenever the German national team, they all wore the Adidas brand soccer cleat, and that's really what catapulted Adidas into a leadership in the industry. And so that kind of happened, I think, in the mid 1900s. That makes me feel very old saying that, but in the mid 1900s, something along those lines. And then they were doing well until about the 70s or 80s, and that's whenever they started to have some struggles whenever it came to sales and revenues, because the competition started to pick up. You started having Nike and Reebok starting to come into the game. And one thing during the 70s and 80s, when they were really struggling whenever it came to sales and revenues, at least from what I understand, is that they were just slow to adapt to the consumers' wants and needs of apparel and things of that nature. They wanted more colors. They wanted, different options out there. And Nike and Reebok were really doing that and providing that solution to the consumers. And Adidas was still stuck on what had gotten them there as well. So they were very slow to adapt to that change and that consumer change. And so it really hurt them in those 2 decades. And one thing to know about whenever we're talking about these, man, some of these businesses and brands, I mean, they go through decades of struggles, where we may talk about a bad year, bad month, whatever. I mean, we're talking decades for the ship to get righted in some of these scenarios. And then, so you get through the 70s and 80s, they make those adjustments. And the big takeaway there, obviously, is always be aware of what the consumers want. They ultimately are going to make or break your business. What do they want? As you continue and go decade by decade, and you continue to grow and stay around, the wants and the needs are going to change. Technology changes, everything changes. And so people are going to want stuff differently, and you're going to need to stay ahead of that. Continue keeping up to date with what your customers are saying and what they want and what the trends are, and make sure that you are tapping into those in order to stay relevant and in order to stay on top of the game. Otherwise, competitors are going to come in and crush you. And so you saw that happen with the 70s and 80s. And then they got that moving right back in the right direction just to head into the 90s, which is where another rough patch came, where they had a bit of a reputation issue that went about. And I think it was something along the lines of some child labor issues mixed with some environmental or pollution type things with the supply chain that they were dealing with or utilizing. And the big thing is that they just were a little slow, from what I remember and understand, to address it. And so anytime something goes on longer and longer and longer, that's going to continue damaging your reputation. If something happens, look, we can't control everything, and there's a lot of stuff that's going to happen. But if something happens and it's negative, or it's something that is deemed to be not good, for lack of a better term, or unethical, or whatever it may be, you got to really make adjustments. You got to address it as soon as possible. Otherwise, it's just going to continue leaving a stain on your reputation, your brand. So they had to work through that. And what they did was, after finally addressing it, I know that they went and they started. They joined the Fair Labor Association, I believe. They started getting heavily involved in that. They brought on new policies and systems to address a lot of these issues. A code of conduct they put together for suppliers. So they really did a lot of good things. And I think they even implemented a sustainability strategy as well, in order to really try to make up for these issues that were happening. So they did a little bit of damage control, got things back on track, towards the end of the 90s, I believe, going into the early 2000s. And they finally get things back rolling. So they make the adjustment. The big takeaway from that issue is, anything that comes across as negative, you've got to get and address it fast. And that's the big thing, is like, if something happens, you can't control everything. Bad things are going to happen. Things are going to slip through the cracks. Obviously you don't want any of it to be intentional, but sometimes it just happens. You have to make decisions fast, and you have to address it as quickly as possible, in order to have the best, best opportunity to continue moving forward in a good way. So the next things, they get in, they start going into the 2000s, and they're dealing with a lot of slow growth. Like, they're dealing with slow revenue and slow sales. And the main reason was they were really reliant on just their sports categories. So they didn't diversify. Once again, they didn't really look at the consumers and the trends in the markets, where Nike specifically was just, they were taking the ball and running. Like, they were crushing it, and Adidas had a hard time keeping up with that. Nike was just doing it better. And so Adidas had to figure out, if we're going to compete here, we're going to have to really up our game. So they started then launching some new products. I remember one product, because I played soccer and I loved it, was the Predator soccer shoe. And that was something that I liked it. And then at a certain point I didn't. So I stopped wearing them. But the Predator, man, that was a big campaign. It was a very popular shoe, at least whenever I was growing up. It may still be, I'm not sure. And so that was a big, I remember those marketing campaigns, those ad campaigns. They really pushed that hard. It was a really big win. But also, too, what they started doing is they started signing sponsorship deals with what we would refer as, I guess they were stars at the time, and still are. And rest in peace, Kobe Bryant. But Kobe Bryant was one of them. It was a huge deal for Adidas to get that, and in order to continue competing with Nike. And so, they started really focusing in on getting ambassadors of their brand, and starting to wear that, starting to talk about it and show up in commercials. And that really started to catapult that. But also, too, started to innovate new apparel, new options, new categories as well, which helped them continue to compete and get back on track. So the big lesson to take away from that, obviously, is, once again, you've got to be looking at the market. You've got to know what your consumers want. You got to know what the trends are. You got to know that, hey, just because we're living in this space, if we've got goals, maybe if their goal was just to stay in the sports side of things, or in that industry and in those categories, then they may have been all right. But if they wanted more, and they wanted to compete against the Nikes out there and continue going up against them, they were going to have to adapt, and they were going to have to get outside of their comfort zone and what had just gotten them there. And so that's whenever you have to start really adjusting and adapting in order to get where you want to go and what your mission and vision. That's why that stuff plays such a big role. If that's not what you want, then you may not have to do it. You may be fine with where you're at and just living in that space and owning that space. But if you want more and you want to compete in certain areas and do certain things and get to certain places, you have to be willing to look at all the different things. And it starts with, what do the consumers want, because they're the ones buying it. Then, how do you build that brand? How do you get that brand out there in the right way? How do you expand your offerings in a way that is going to be sustainable, that is going to allow you to remain profitable and not get you into some bad situations? All of this stuff that needs to come into play. But the big thing is adapting and staying ahead of the curve, and ultimately looking at where you ultimately want to go and what your mission and vision is, and then doing the things necessary to continue moving forward whenever it comes to that. So these were big issues that Adidas went through in order to get it. There were a lot of ups and downs over the last few decades for Adidas, but they obviously have been on a really good run. I know that kind of a rough patch, but it's one that was a little bit a little bit closer to us here recently, was just the COVID-19 pandemic and everything that had to happen. I mean, they really had to address disruptions to the global supply chain whenever that came about. And they had to really put a big focus on e-commerce and digital sales channels, which they were able to do. So while it was tough for a brand like Adidas to go through that, and it was a struggle, they were able to adapt during that time. And actually, they're way ahead now because they had to make those adjustments during that time. And so, obviously now having to report that first annual loss, even since the year 2000, they've had a really good run. Obviously, this is just another rough patch. I fully believe that Adidas is going to come out stronger on the other side of it and make the proper adjustments that they feel is right. But just goes to show, I mean, these are things that you go through trying to build a business and build a brand. And regardless if it's small or if it's a large brand like Adidas, you're going to go through these times, and you have to know how to adapt. You have to know what decisions to make and how to best avoid it taking decades, or taking a decade, or taking a year, or taking a month, and being able to adjust to that and make the right decision. So that's what I take away from a lot of this. Whenever I go back and I'm really looking at Adidas and some of the things that really pertain to what we do today and what we can be looking at. But adaptability is obviously a big one, making quick adjustments, staying ahead of the trends, knowing what your consumers want, and then also following your mission and vision to know what you need to be doing next, and in order to continue driving towards those goals. So if you have any questions, or you're struggling with things, go to linchpincoach.com as well. So just kind of a shameless plug, but I can help you get through a lot of this stuff, help you come up with great blueprints to get you going, get done with that unstuck feeling as well. So linchpincoach.com, schedule a blueprint call with me, and I'd love to speak with you. All the best.